February 21, 1965, Malcolm X collapsed with 16 bullets in his chest. In the Audubon Ballroom, 400 people screamed in terror, but one man sat in complete silence. Bumpy Johnson didn't move, didn't cry, didn't speak. He just stared at the stage where his friend had fallen. And in that silence, something dangerous was being born. This is the story history doesn't want you to know. The story of how a gangster and a revolutionary became brothers, and how that brotherhood changed everything. Most people think Malcolm X and Bumpy Johnson were enemies, a civil rights leader and a criminal. But the truth is more complicated than history books will admit. These two men weren't just friends, they were family. To understand their bond, you need to understand Harlem in the 1950s. Malcolm X had the power you see, the speeches, the crowds, the media attention. When Malcolm spoke, the world listened. Bumpy Johnson had the power you don't see, the streets, the money, the protection. When Bumpy whispered, Harlem obeyed. Most men with this much power become rivals. Malcolm and Bumpy became brothers. It started in 1952. Malcolm had just been released from prison, transformed into Malcolm X by his conversion to Islam. He was 27 years old, brilliant, but naive about the streets. The nation had sent him to Harlem to build their movement, but Harlem already belonged to someone else. Bumpy Johnson was 47, at the height of his power. He controlled the numbers racket from 110th Street to the Bronx. Every hustler, every policy banker in Harlem either worked for Bumpy or paid tribute to him. This was his kingdom. When word spread that a young Muslim preacher was holding rallies in Marcus Garvey Park, drawing crowds that could disrupt business, Bumpy's lieutenants wanted to shut it down. Send the word, they told Bumpy. Tell him to take his meetings somewhere else. But Bumpy was curious. On a hot July evening in 1952, he walked to Marcus Garvey Park to hear this Malcolm X for himself. What he found changed both their lives forever. Malcolm was speaking to maybe 200 people, mostly young black men who'd been written off by society. Ex-convicts, hustlers, addicts, but Malcolm wasn't preaching to them. He was speaking with them. The white man has taught you to hate yourself, Malcolm said, his voice carrying across the park. But you are not what they say you are. You are descendants of kings, of builders, of mathematicians and philosophers. The white man fears you because he knows your true power. Bumpy watched from the back. He'd heard plenty of preachers before, most of them hustlers in their own way. But Malcolm was different. He wasn't asking for money or obedience. He was giving something away, dignity. After the speech, Bumpy approached Malcolm. "Walk with me," Bumpy said quietly. It wasn't a request. They walked in silence through Harlem's late-night streets, past the jazz clubs and policy banks, past the hustlers and working families, through the kingdom that Bumpy had built. Finally, Malcolm spoke. "I know who you are," Malcolm said. "Bumpy Johnson, the man who runs these streets." "And I know who you are," Bumpy replied. "Malcolm X, the man who wants to change them." They stopped at 125th and Lenox Avenue, the heart of Harlem. Bumpy turned to face Malcolm directly. "Question is, can we do both?" That conversation changed everything. Over the next 13 years, Malcolm X and Bumpy Johnson built one of the most unlikely partnerships in American history. Not a business partnership. Malcolm never took dirty money, and Bumpy never pretended to be righteous, but a brotherhood based on mutual respect and shared love for their people. Malcolm provided the vision. Bumpy provided the protection. When Malcolm held rallies in Harlem, Bumpy's men provided security, not officially, not visibly, but effectively. Malcolm never had to worry about troublemakers, hecklers, or worse. Bumpy made sure the meetings ran smooth. When civil rights workers came to Harlem, when activists faced harassment, when families needed protection from racist cops or corrupt landlords, Malcolm would make a phone call, and Bumpy would handle it quietly, efficiently, permanently. But the partnership went deeper than business. These two men genuinely liked each other. Malcolm, the intellectual, was fascinated by Bumpy's strategic mind and street wisdom. Bumpy, the pragmatist, was inspired by Malcolm's vision and moral clarity. They would meet monthly, always privately, usually walking through Harlem late at night. They'd discuss philosophy, strategy, the future of Black America. Malcolm would share what he'd learned from his reading, his travels, his spiritual journey. Bumpy would share what he'd learned from the streets, from power, from survival. These were education sessions. Malcolm learned how power really works in America, not just the power of words, but the power of money, influence, and strategic thinking. Bumpy learned about history, about the global struggle for Black liberation, about possibilities beyond the streets. Their friendship was so secret that even their closest associates didn't know the full extent. Malcolm's followers in the Nation of Islam would have been scandalized to know their leader was friends with a criminal. Bumpy's crew would have questioned his judgment for trusting a preacher who wanted to change everything they profited from. But both men understood something history has forgotten. Real change requires both moral authority and practical power. Malcolm provided the moral authority. Bumpy provided the practical power. Together, they were building something unprecedented. The partnership faced its first major test in 1959 when Malcolm began attracting national attention. Mike Wallace's documentary, The Hate That Hate Produced, made Malcolm X a household name and a target. The FBI opened a file on him. Death threats arrived daily. That's when Bumpy stepped up. Without Malcolm asking, Bumpy assigned his best men to watch Malcolm's house, his mosque, his regular haunts. He put word on the street that anyone who touched Malcolm X would answer to Bumpy Johnson personally. The threats stopped. By 1964, Malcolm had left the Nation of Islam to form his own organization. He'd made a pilgrimage to Mecca that transformed his thinking about race and Islam. He was evolving, growing, becoming more dangerous to the system that wanted him contained. The threats against Malcolm's life became serious. Not street threats, but professional threats. The kind that Bumpy recognized immediately. Someone with resources, with connections, with official backing, wanted Malcolm X dead. Bumpy offered to eliminate the threat. "Give me names," he told Malcolm. "I'll handle this the way I handle all problems." But Malcolm refused. "Violence is what they expect from us," Malcolm said. "Violence is what they use to justify destroying us. I won't give them that excuse." Bumpy understood, but he also understood something Malcolm didn't fully grasp. Sometimes your enemies don't care about excuses. Sometimes they're going to try to destroy you anyway. February 21st, 1965. The Audubon Ballroom. Malcolm X was scheduled to speak to the Organization of Afro-American Unity. Bumpy had offered security, but Malcolm had declined. He wanted to show that his movement was about peace, not violence. Bumpy respected Malcolm's decision, but he didn't ignore his instincts. He came to the speech anyway, sitting in the back, watching the crowd, reading the room the way he'd read countless situations over the years. Something was wrong. Bumpy felt it immediately. The crowd was different. Too many unfamiliar faces, too many men who looked like they were working, not listening, too many exit points being watched by people who weren't there for Malcolm's message. At 3:05 p.m., Malcolm X took the stage. "Assalamu alaikum," he began, the traditional Muslim greeting. And that's when everything went wrong. A disturbance in the front rows. Someone shouting, "Take your hand out of my pocket." Heads turning, attention diverted. Malcolm calling for calm. And then the shots. Bumpy saw the gunman before anyone else. His street instincts, honed by decades of violence, spotted the weapons, the positioning, the coordination. This wasn't a spontaneous attack. This was a professional hit. But by the time Bumpy could react, it was over. 16 shots in fewer than 15 seconds. Malcolm X was dead before the echo stopped. The ballroom erupted in chaos. People screaming, running, diving for cover. And Bumpy Johnson sitting perfectly still, watching everything, memorizing faces, taking mental notes about something that looked like random violence but wasn't random at all. 3 men were arrested. Talmadge Hayer, Norman 3X Butler, and Thomas 15X Johnson, all members of the Nation of Islam. The story was simple. Malcolm had left the nation, criticized Elijah Muhammad, and his former brothers had killed him for apostasy. But Bumpy Johnson knew better. He'd seen professional hits before. This was coordinated, planned, financed by someone with serious resources. The Nation of Islam foot soldiers might have pulled the triggers, but someone else had ordered the execution. Over the next 48 hours, while the media focused on the arrested gunman and the world mourned Malcolm X, Bumpy conducted his own investigation. He used his network of informants, his connections in law enforcement, his understanding of how power really works. What he discovered made him angrier than he'd been in decades. The hit on Malcolm hadn't just been sanctioned by the Nation of Islam leadership. It had been encouraged, facilitated, and possibly funded by federal agencies who saw Malcolm's evolution as a threat to national security. The FBI had infiltrated the Nation of Islam. They'd used informants to stoke the conflict between Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad. They'd withdrawn Malcolm's police protection in the weeks before his death. They'd created the conditions for assassination and then stood back while it happened. Malcolm X hadn't just been killed by religious extremists. He'd been killed by his own government, using religious extremists as cover. For most men, this knowledge would have been overwhelming. For Bumpy Johnson, it was just another problem to solve. He couldn't bring Malcolm back, but he could make sure Malcolm's killers paid a price beyond what the justice system would ever impose. February 24, 1965. 3 days after Malcolm's assassination, Bumpy attended the funeral at Faith Temple Church of God in Christ. 20,000 people lined the streets of Harlem to pay their respects. After the funeral, Bumpy went to work. The 3 gunmen in custody were obvious targets, but they were also obvious protections. Killing them would be expected, predictable, and ultimately pointless. They were foot soldiers, not generals. Bumpy was thinking bigger. Instead, he focused on the handlers, the FBI agents who had orchestrated the infiltration, the Nation of Islam officials who had provided cover, the politicians who had given unofficial approval, people who thought they were untouchable because they operated from behind desks instead of in the streets. Over the next 6 months, a series of accidents befell people connected to Malcolm's assassination. A federal agent's car suffered catastrophic brake failure on a lonely highway. A Nation of Islam official's house burned down in a gas leak explosion. A political operative had a heart attack at age 35 with no history of heart disease. Nothing could be traced back to Bumpy Johnson. These weren't street hits. These were sophisticated operations that looked like accidents, illnesses, or random tragedies. But the message was clear. Malcolm X had been protected even in death. The most significant target was FBI Assistant Director William Sullivan, who had run the COINTELPRO operation against black activists. In September 1965, Sullivan's weekend fishing cabin burned to the ground while he was inside. Sullivan survived, but barely. He suffered third-degree burns over 60% of his body and spent 8 months in the hospital. The official investigation concluded that faulty wiring had caused the fire, but Sullivan knew better. When he returned to work, he quietly transferred out of operations targeting black nationalist groups. He never spoke publicly about why. Years later, in 1977, Sullivan was killed in a hunting accident. The hunter was never identified. The case was never solved. Bumpy Johnson had been dead for 9 years by then, but his network was still operational. But Bumpy's most important action after Malcolm's death wasn't about revenge. It was about legacy. Using his network and resources, Bumpy quietly supported legitimate efforts to continue Malcolm's work while undermining infiltration attempts. He provided funding for Malcolm's family, ensuring that Betty Shabazz and her daughters were financially secure. He protected Malcolm's closest associates from harassment and threats. Most importantly, Bumpy used his influence to keep Malcolm's true message alive, not the sanitized version that the government preferred, but the complex, evolving vision that Malcolm had been developing in his final years. The partnership between the gangster and the revolutionary didn't end with Malcolm's death. It evolved into something deeper, a commitment to protecting the legacy of a man who had died trying to liberate his people. Bumpy Johnson died in 1968, 3 years after Malcolm X. He was having dinner at Wells Restaurant in Harlem when he suffered a massive heart attack. His last words, according to witnesses, were about Malcolm. "He was right about everything. We should have listened." The true story of Malcolm X and Bumpy Johnson's friendship remained buried for decades, but the evidence is there. In Malcolm's personal papers, there are references to BJ providing assistance with security concerns. In FBI files, there are reports of unidentified street sources protecting Malcolm. In police records, there are multiple instances of violence against Malcolm's enemies that were never solved. But the strongest evidence is in the results. Malcolm X became a global icon whose message outlasted his enemies. His killers faced justice that went far beyond what any court could provide. And his family survived despite being targeted by powerful forces in America. That protection didn't happen by accident. It happened because a gangster and a revolutionary understood that their fight was the same fight, just from different angles, and that brotherhood, secret though it was, changed the course of history. Malcolm X dreamed of a world where black people could live with dignity, safety, and power. Bumpy Johnson built a world where at least some black people could live with dignity, safety, and power. Together, they created something neither could have achieved alone, a legacy that their enemies couldn't kill. This is why they kept the friendship secret, not because they were ashamed, but because they understood that the truth was more dangerous than any lie. The truth that moral authority and street power could work together. The truth that the system's greatest fear wasn't violence or protest, but coordination between those who could inspire and those who could act. If this story of brotherhood, loyalty, and justice moved you, hit that subscribe button. Share this with someone who understands that real change requires both vision and power. And in the comments, let me know, do you think Malcolm and Bumpy's friendship could exist today? Next week, we're revealing how Bumpy Johnson's organization continued protecting civil rights leaders even after his death. You won't want to miss that.